We are in the book of Micah today. Micah is one of the minor prophets, last 12 books of the Old Testament, and we've been working our way through these books over the last couple of months, and today we're in Micah. Micah is like all of the other ones. There's like a pattern that he follows. He starts by saying bad stuff is happening, or maybe bad stuff is going to happen. Right? Then he explains why, and usually it's the same reason. With Israel and Judah, it's always idolatry, immorality, or injustice. And so, hey Israel, hey Judah, hey Jerusalem, hey Samaria, bad things are happening, and it's because of idolatry, immorality, and or injustice. But then all the prophets take a shift and they say, but there's a solution, there's an answer. It doesn't have to be this way. There's something you can do about this. You can repent and you can return. To repent is to say, I am wrong. And if Israel, if Judah, if you'll say you were wrong and you'll return to God, and instead of idolatry, you'll worship him. Instead of immorality, you'll live his way. Instead of injustice, you'll love justice and you'll love mercy. If you'll return to God, things can be better. But then all of the prophets also end with this really beautiful picture of who God is and what he wants to do. And many of them have this future-oriented perspective of God has great plans that are coming down the road, and Micah is just like all of them. So in Micah, we're reading how bad things are coming for the nation of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. And one of the bad things that's happening is Babylon is coming. And we know from history that Babylon is going to ultimately destroy Jerusalem, and Micah talks about that a little bit. In chapter 5, he says, hey, Jerusalem, warriors, get up, get ready, prepare. Here come the Babylonians, and they are going to strike you and strike you hard. And then in verse 2, he shifts direction. And he stops talking about war, and he stops talking about Jerusalem, and he refocuses on another place. He says, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah. So Bethlehem is this little town. It's a little bit outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem's the big capital city, the walled city. It's where all the important stuff happens. And then just a little bit outside of Jerusalem is little Bethlehem. And Micah says, hey, everybody, look at Bethlehem. Even though they are small, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Now, when Micah's audience, his original audience, heard this, their first thought would have been of King David. Remember, King David is the greatest king Israel ever had. He was born in Bethlehem. And so for them, Bethlehem was known as the city of David. And so when he starts talking about a king or a ruler coming out of Bethlehem, immediately they think of David. But Micah is actually talking about someone else here. Right. Now, he wants to connect this person to David because this person is a descendant of David. God made a promise to David. When David was king, he went to God and said, hey, can I build you a temple? And God said, no, I want your son to do that, but David, I'm going to build a house for you. And he said, I'm going to give you a descendant, David, who will sit on your throne forever and ever. This is what we call a messianic promise. God was promising that someone from the line of David would rule forever and ever. And so now, from here on in the Old Testament, we see these little hints every so often about this messianic figure who's going to come down the road. We know he's from the line of David. Now, if you read in Matthew, you know already that Jesus is from the line of David through Mary, his mother. And so we know that Micah is actually talking about Jesus. In fact, when we see Bethlehem, that's what we think, isn't it? When we see Bethlehem, immediately we think of Christmas, because at Christmas, Jesus was born in the manger at Bethlehem. But I love how Micah describes him here. He says, one will come whose origins are from old, from ancient times. This phrase literally means if you look back at the horizon behind you, this is beyond what you can see. And so what Micah is saying is the Messiah who is coming will come from the line of David, will be born in Bethlehem. His origins are from eternity past. So he's really special and he's really unique. Now, when we read this, we may just go flying past it. But I want you to hit the brakes for a second and realize what this is. Because Micah is writing 400 years before Jesus. He's predicting 400 years before Jesus, where Jesus is going to be born. Now some who may not want to be impressed by that might say, well, isn't it possible, David? I mean, the Bible, it's an ancient book. It's old, thousands of years old. Isn't it possible that maybe after Jesus was born, someone kind of wrote this part in and then inserted it to kind of make it look like it had been prophesied ahead of time, but really they just kind of filled it in after? Isn't that possible? And if you had said that to me 80 years ago, I mean, if I'd been alive 80 years ago, but if you had said that to me 80 years ago, I would not have had an answer for you. I wouldn't have been able to counter that argument. But the good news is, 80 years ago, an archaeological discovery was made that gives us an answer to that question. 80 years ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered over in Israel. This is a whole big, massive group of ancient scrolls that were discovered in jars and pots in a cave in Israel. And as scientists begin to evaluate them and examine them, now, these are not scientists that believe in Jesus. These are not Christians, right? These are just scientists, maybe some of them even atheists, using the same dating methods that they use for everything else, radiocarbon dating. They were able to date these scrolls, some to 100 up to 250 years before Jesus. And Micah was one of these scrolls. So what that means is we have archaeological proof that Micah was written before Jesus was born. In fact, the oldest copy we have is 100 to 200 years older than Jesus, but that's just a copy. That means the original was written sometime before that. And you know what else were in there? Copies of Hosea, copies of Zechariah, copies of Isaiah, which means that we have great confidence that these books, these minor prophets that all talk about Jesus and his coming, were written before Jesus. They're actually prophesying a future event that turns out to be a historical event that we can look back on and say, wow, that's pretty cool. That these guys, hundreds of years before Jesus, were able to predict with detail his coming. Let me show you how cool this is. All right, we're going to do some math. Are we excited about that? People are like, yeah, math. Some of you are like, man, I'm excited about that as I am about doing grammar. All right, but I've got some golf balls up here this morning. Some of you are like, okay, now I'm excited. Are we going to play golf? No, we're doing math. All right, so I've got a white golf ball and an orange golf ball. The odds, if I was blindfolded and reached into this container, the odds that I would pull out the orange golf ball are what? 50-50, right? 50%, 1 out of 2, say it however you want. It's all the same. Let's see. I got it. I nailed it. All right, so 1 out of 2. Good. Now, imagine there are two baby boys who are born in Bethlehem. And one of them is born from the line of David. That means that in Bethlehem right now, there's a 50% chance that one of them is the fulfillment of prophecy, right? But it's really probably not realistic that there's just two baby boys born in Bethlehem. We'll put one more in. Now there's 3, and the odds change, right? Now the odds are no longer 50-50, 50%, 1 out of 2. The odds are 1 out of 3 or 33% if you're a math nerd. And see, I missed it, right? I didn't get it, 1 out of 3, because it's a little less likely that I'm going to grab the orange ball this time. But let's be honest. We all know that there are more than 3 baby boys who have been born in Bethlehem. So let's just say there have been 20. Okay, so we're going to go 20 because that's a nice easy number. There we go. Got them all. All right. So now there's 20 baby boys. What are the odds that I can reach in here and grab the orange one? Some of you are like 5% because I'm good at math. We'll just say 1 in 20 for the rest of us, okay? 1 in 20 for the rest of us. And again, I didn't get it. But do you see how, as the pool of babies goes up, the likelihood that one of them is going to fulfill the prophecy goes down? But now let's talk about what's really going on here, because the prophecy that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem is not the only prophecy about the coming Messiah. For example, Malachi the prophet predicted that before the Messiah, there would be another prophet who would come and prepare the way. Now, we know from history that that's John the Baptist, right? But if we're talking odds here, if I want to calculate the odds of both of those prophecies being true about the same person, I have to now reach in twice and 2 times in a row get the orange ball. So let's see. Didn't get it, right? The odds that I could reach in here 2 times in a row, grab the orange ball both times, are 1 in 400. Okay, that's 0.25% for those of you who want to know that. 1 in 400. Those are pretty slim odds that I could do that. So when we talk about the likelihood of one person fulfilling both of those prophecies, the odds are pretty slim. But those aren't the only prophecies about the coming Messiah. In fact, there's a whole bunch more. Matthew, which is the first book of the New Testament, one of the Gospels, it's the story of Jesus written by Matthew, was written specifically to the Jewish people to help them understand that Jesus was the Messiah. And so in Matthew's Gospel, over and over again, he uses this phrase. He says, "This was done to fulfill what was said by the prophet." Or he says, Jesus did this to fulfill what was said by the prophet. Because what he's pointing out is all of these Old Testament prophecies 400 years earlier that were made about Jesus that Jesus fulfilled. Let me show you a few, okay? Matthew chapter 1. Matthew says, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." That was prophesied in Isaiah chapter 7. So now the picture is we have descendant of David, born in Bethlehem, preceded by a messenger, John, also born of a virgin. But that's not it. Matthew chapter 2, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." This is from Hosea chapter 11, where God said, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And so now what we're saying is this messianic figure who is yet to come in Micah's time, this messianic figure, line of David, born in Bethlehem, prophet comes before him, born of a virgin, somehow comes up out of Egypt. And what we know about Jesus is that when he was young, probably 2 years old, his parents fled to Egypt to avoid him being killed by Herod. And so later, when he was a little bit older, what did they do? They came up out of Egypt, just as was prophesied. There's more. Matthew chapter 4 says, "And leaving Nazareth," that's where Jesus grew up, "he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled." Because in Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah said, "The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light." So the prophecy is the people living in darkness will see a great light. They're going to see something from this Messiah in Galilee. Where did Jesus do the majority of his works, the majority of his ministry? In Galilee. And Matthew saying the reason Jesus came to Galilee was to fulfill the prophecy that Isaiah had made. Can I do this one more time? Line of David, preceded by a messenger, born in Bethlehem, born to a virgin, up from Egypt, ministry in Galilee. And you're beginning to say, wow, there's an awful lot going on here that one person has to fulfill if that person is going to be the Messiah, but I'm not done. Matthew 8. "That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 53. He took our illnesses and bore our disease." Let me show you one more. This isn't all of them. I kind of cherry-picked a few. Matthew 21. "This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet." He's talking here about Zechariah chapter 9, saying, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you." So that's the messianic reference. Your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. Most kings don't ride donkeys, but Jesus did. So do you see what Jesus did? And there's more than this, but just what we've looked at briefly this morning. Line of David, born in Bethlehem, preceded by a messenger, born to a virgin, up from Egypt, lived in Galilee, did miracles, rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, what are the odds that one person could fulfill all of those prophecies made 400 years ago? Well, I don't know the exact odds, but let's just say we're starting with 20 kids born in Bethlehem. And obviously, it's way more than that. But if it's just 20 kids born in Bethlehem, now, if I want to fulfill 6 prophecies, what I would have to do is reach into here 6 times in a row, blindfolded, and each time That's one. Each time, pull out the orange one. Yeah, and I fail, right? I'm not the Messiah. The odds of that happening, 6 in a row, 1 in 64 million. Let me give you a picture so you can see exactly what that looks like. If we took 6 football fields and put them all together and then covered all of them with golf balls. So you have 6 football fields all full of white golf balls. And we take one orange golf ball and just throw it out in the middle. And then I blindfold you and say, go out, pick one golf ball, let's see if you get the orange one. You would say, that's impossible. And I would say, no, it's improbable. Because it is actually technically possible, right? And that's what Jesus did. 1 in 64 million. Like, why does this even matter? Because I want you to understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises. And because Jesus was able to fulfill all of these promises and more, we know that God is trustworthy. If God says he's going to do something, he does it. And Jesus is the perfect picture of that. But here's the best part. We haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. We haven't even gotten to the best pictures of Jesus in the Old Testament. We haven't even talked about the most accurate predictions, because most of them happen in one chapter in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53 is often called the chapter about the suffering servant. It's a picture that Isaiah paints of the coming Messiah, which is kind of dark, because there's a lot of suffering that goes on. But it's also a chapter that kind of ties together a whole bunch of different parts of the Bible. Let me show you how it does that. In Acts chapter 8, there's this story of a man who is from Ethiopia. He's a servant to the royal family in Ethiopia, but he's in Israel. And he's riding along in a chariot in Israel, and it tells us that he's there. He's going to Jerusalem to worship. So he's going to worship the God of Israel, even though he's from Ethiopia. And as he's going along, he's got this scroll, and he's reading a scroll. They run into a guy named Philip, who is one of Jesus' earliest followers. And Philip says, hey, what are you reading? He's like, well, I'm reading this scroll, but I don't know what it means. And Philip says, well, let me take a look. And he says, what's your question? He said, well, I'm reading this passage, and I just don't know who it's talking about. What was he reading? He was reading Isaiah 53. Now, this raises questions for me, right? Number one, how does a guy from Ethiopia, long ways away, get a scroll of Isaiah? And why is a guy from Ethiopia coming to Jerusalem to worship the God of the Jews? Because he's from another continent. Well, the answer is actually in the Bible. Some of you remember 2 weeks ago when we were talking about Jonah, and I told you what Jesus said about Jonah. Remember, he said to the people looking for a sign, I'm not going to give you a sign, but you'll get a sign. It's the sign of Jonah, 3 days in the ground, and then I rise again. And then he said, the men of Nineveh will rise up and condemn this generation, because they had Jonah and repented, and you have me and haven't repented. And we kind of ended there. But if we had kept going in that passage, the next thing that Jesus said was, and the queen of the south will rise up against this generation at the final judgment. And she also will condemn you, because you had me, she only had Solomon, and she repented. And we're all like, well, who is the queen of the south? What is this all about? So now we skip all the way back to 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10, Solomon is the king of Israel, and he's having all of these dignitaries and royalty come to visit him because he's so wealthy and so wise. And one of the visitors, in fact, the only visitor that we have any details about, is called the Queen of Sheba. She is the queen of the south. She is the queen of Ethiopia. she comes and visits Solomon. And we don't have a lot of details about her visit, but what we know is in that visit, she converted and became a worshiper of the one true God, the God of Israel, went back to her country and said, we're not worshiping the false gods anymore. This is our God, which is why hundreds of years later, a servant to the royal family is coming to Jerusalem to worship the one true God, because that's who the people in his country worship. Pretty cool, isn't it? But I'm not done. It gets better. So this guy is reading this scroll, and he's talking to Philip, and he says, I don't know who this is. Who's this person that this chapter is talking about? And Philip says, hey, guess what? I know him. And he begins to tell him, this is Jesus. And he tells him the story of Jesus, about his life, his death, his resurrection. And as a result, this man repents of his sins, gives his life to Jesus, says, hey, there's some water, I should get baptized. And Philip's like, yeah, you should, let's go. So he baptizes him and sends him back to his country. End of the story, right? Wrong. Because today, 2023, today, one of, if not the oldest continuously worshiping churches in the world is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. A church of people who have followed Jesus for over 2,000 years, beginning with this man who met Philip while reading Isaiah 53. And the reason I'm telling you all this is just because it's so cool. But also, I want you to see this, that the internal and external consistency of the Bible, historically, archaeologically, is incredibly trustworthy. You can believe what you read in God's book. You can believe what it tells you about God, and you can believe that when God makes a promise, he keeps it. But let's look at Isaiah 53, because we find Jesus here. Isaiah 53, Isaiah is writing, let me just show you a couple of quick statements. Talking about Jesus, he says, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance. He's talking about Jesus suffering before his crucifixion. He was whipped, he was beaten, he was punched, he was slapped. So much so that he didn't even look like a man. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Remember when Jesus was on trial and they were lying about him and falsely accusing him, and he simply stood there silently to fulfill what had been said by the prophet Isaiah. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. And here we say, well, this feels like a little bit of a paradox. Which is it? Was he with the wicked or was he with the wealthy? Well, remember, Jesus was crucified between two thieves, the wicked. And he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy, all to fulfill what was written by the prophet Isaiah 600 years ago. And by the way, one of those scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls is called the Great Isaiah Scroll, because it contains almost the entire book of Isaiah, word for word, with the copies that we have today. That's how reliable this is. That's how certain you can be that God said this is going to happen, and then it happened. But we're not talking about this today just so we can say, oh, that's cool. And we're not talking about this today just so we can go out and win arguments with atheists. That's not the point. The reason I'm showing you this today is because I want you to understand that God has something for you. That God wants to upend your life. He wants to change your life. He wants to take the burden that you've been bearing. He wants to take the load that you've been carrying. He wants to heal you. He wants to forgive you. He wants to change you. He wants to give you a new life. And he reveals all of that to us in Isaiah chapter 53. Stay with me as I read. Verse 4. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Do you hear this? When you find yourself in a time of grief, when you find yourself in a time of sorrow, God understands. One of the reasons that Jesus went to the cross was so that we would understand that he has suffered like we have in every way. And when we are in pain, he understands that pain. When we are in sorrow, he is with us in the sorrow. He is with us in the grief. But look at this. It says, yet we esteemed him stricken and smitten by God and afflicted. Isaiah says, as Jesus hangs there, as the Messiah is suffering and being acquainted with grief and sorrow, the people who are there will look at him and say, this is your own fault. God is mad at you. And do you remember what happened while Jesus was on the cross? What did they say to him? If you're truly the Son of God, come down and save yourself. Just as Isaiah prophesied. But it wasn't his fault. God wasn't angry at him, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement or the punishment that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed. These are great words. So the word transgression, it really means to violate the law of God, to violate the way of God, to sin against God. And so when we don't worship God as he deserves, when we don't make him first in our life, when we idolize other things, whether it be money or pleasure or comfort or popularity, whatever it might be, when we idolize those things, those are transgressions. That's us stepping away from God. And Isaiah says the Messiah will be pierced, nails in his hands, a spear through his side, a crown of thorns shoved down onto his head. He will be pierced because of our transgressions, because we have sinned against God. And then he says he will be crushed for our iniquities. That's not a word we use very often, is it? I mean, you don't walk around hearing people in the office say, hey, you're so full of iniquity. It's not one of those words. Now, the English language is a funny language. It's kind of a mutt language. It's lots of different languages coming together. Like there's some German there, there's some Latin there, there's some French there, there's some Old English there. They all come together. And this word iniquity is one of those things that actually is more ancient French than anything else. And we can really understand what it means if we say it a little bit differently. So instead of saying iniquity, you say inequity. That helps us see what he's talking about here. He's talking about when we sin against other people. So when we lie, when we cheat, when we steal, when we're unfaithful, when we gossip, when we slander, you name it, the sins that we commit against others, Isaiah says the Messiah will be crushed for those. Because our relational sins can be crushing, can't they? Our relational sins can put a heavy load on us, whether it's something we've done or something that someone else has done for us. We can be crushed by that. And understand here that it's not just that Jesus is taking your iniquity. He's also taking the iniquity of the person sitting next to you. And I know some of you are thinking, yeah, that's a lot more than mine. But he's taking all of the iniquity of all of the people who have ever lived for all time, and that is a crushing burden that will kill him. And here's where we say, but why? Why does sin require death? I want you to imagine that you come up to me after church and say, hey, David, I need a little bit of help. I've got to run some errands today. My car's on the fritz. Could I borrow your car? I'm like, yeah, sure, that'd be fine. Just don't destroy it, but whatever. Like, cool, thanks. And you take off and you bring it back to my house that evening, and I go out and I'm like, what happened here? There are like cups everywhere. There's Speedway cups, right? There's Burger King cups, there's McDonald's cups everywhere. Clearly you spilled something on the seat. I'm not sure what it is. There's popcorn everywhere, and there's just the ever so slight hint of sour milk. I'm like, man, what did you do to my car? You're like, I'm really sorry. I tried to take care of it the best I could. I was a little messy. My bad. I hope you don't mind. I'm like, yeah, cool, whatever. And then next Sunday, you come up to me and say, hey, David, my car's on the fritz again. I've got some errands run. Do you mind if I borrow your car? I say, well, I just got it cleaned, but if you're in need, yeah, sure, just try to do better this time. You're like, I will, no popcorn, I promise. And you bring my car back, and I look inside, and it seems to be a little bit better. There's still that hint of sour milk, because how do you get rid of that? But on the outside, like you've scratched one whole side of it. and the headlight has been bashed in, and the trunk won't close anymore because there's something jammed in there. I'm like, why did you're ruining my car? And you say, I'm really sorry. I tried my best. Well, okay. And then the next Sunday, you come up to me and say, hey, David, I've got some errands to run, but my car's on the fritz. Can I borrow yours? What am I going to say to you? Some of you are like, well, you're a pastor, so you have to say this. No, I do not. I'm going to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, you have lost the privilege of driving my car. Because even though I showed you grace and mercy, you continued to abuse it. You continued to sin against my car. Now, I want you to hear this. Every time I transgress God's will, when I don't live according to his nature, I break his creation. Every time I treat another person unjustly or unfairly, iniquity, I break God's creation. Look around you. The reason this world is broken is because of sin. It's because of selfishness. It's because we go our own way. It's because we do our own thing. It's because we can't get along. You name it, the brokenness in this world is caused by sin. Now, how many times do we have to break God's world before he says, you forfeited the right to be here? I gave you 2 chances with my car, and everybody agreed you shouldn't get a third. How many chances does God have to give us before we say, yeah, he should probably just remove us from this world? Because our sin is destroying his creation. This is why death is necessary. Because the only way to get rid of sin is to get rid of the carriers of sin. We all deserve death. God's given us more than 2 chances. I mean, I sin every day. Every day I transgress. Every day I act with iniquity. And every day God extends more grace and more mercy to me. But that doesn't change the fact that my sin is breaking his creation and my sin deserves death. And that's why Jesus was pierced for my transgressions. And that's why Jesus was crushed for my iniquities. Upon him was the punishment for my peace. You see, the only way for me to be at peace with God is for someone else to take my punishment. That's what Jesus did on the cross. The only way for me to be at peace with others is for someone else to remove my iniquity, and that's why Jesus was crushed. And the only way for me to be at peace with myself is for God to fix what I've already done, and that's what Isaiah says, with his wounds we are healed. Jesus' wounds were for my wounds. My wounds are healed by his wounding. His work on the cross is God's grace and mercy extended to me. So everything I've contributed to the brokenness of the world, that's taken away from me by him. That means I no longer need to hold on to the guilt for what I've done, the ways I've transgressed, for my iniquity. I no longer have to live in shame. I no longer have to keep replaying the regret in my mind of what I've done in the past, because Jesus has healed my wounds. But he keeps going. He says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've wandered off. Right? Now, see, there's some of us who, at some point in our life, we say, I'm going to follow Jesus, right? I'm going to go with Jesus. I'm on team Jesus. I give my life to him. And then what happens? Eventually, we kind of just wander off, kind of do our own thing. All of us like sheep have wandered off. We have turned everyone to his own way. This is what's at the heart of the whole problem, is that we do it our way instead of his way, going all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden. God said, eat all the fruit, eat it freely, except for this one tree. And they said, no, God, we'll do it our way. We'll eat the one tree and ignore all the rest. And since then, this has been what we do. We do it our way instead of his way. Transgression, iniquity, death. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So this is the picture. Here I am, full of transgression, full of iniquity. I've wandered off. I've done it my own way. And so what I have on me is the burden of guilt and shame and despair and regret and you name it, everything else that comes with all of that. And Isaiah says, God has laid on him, on Jesus, all of that. He's taken my transgressions, my iniquity, my sin, my mistakes, my shortcomings, my wandering off. He's taken all of that, my guilt, my shame, my regret. He's taken all of that and he's laid all of that on Jesus. So I no longer have to carry that crushing load. This is the picture of baptism, right? Earlier, Steve talked about baptism in the video. We're having a service in a couple of weeks when any of you can be baptized that want to do that. But this is the picture. When I get into the water, what I'm doing is I'm saying, look, I'm identifying myself with Jesus. I know that I'm carrying my own transgressions and iniquity and guilt and shame and regret. I know that I'm carrying all that. That's a heavy load, but I'm identifying myself with Jesus so that in Jesus' death, I also experience a death. So when I go below the water, that's a picture of Jesus' death, but it's also a picture of my death to sin. It's a picture of my death to self, a picture of my death to transgressions, iniquity, going my own way, doing my own thing, guilt, shame, regret, all of that dead and buried with Jesus. And then the next picture is the best. Because I'm dead and I'm buried with Jesus, and then I am raised to life. And you know what? When Jesus came out of the tomb, he left everything behind him. And when I come up out of the water, that's a symbol that I've left all of that behind me. I no longer have to carry the guilt for my transgressions. I no longer have to carry the shame for my iniquity. I no longer have to carry the regret for going my own way, doing my own thing. I am no longer guilty in the eyes of God for ruining his creation. He took all of that and he put it on Jesus, and Jesus left it in the tomb, so I am raised to new life. That's why Isaiah 53 is in the Bible, is to remind us of what Jesus has done for us. And if that's what Jesus has done for you, then what will you do with Jesus? That's really the question for all of us this morning. What will you do with Jesus? How will you respond to Isaiah 53, to Micah 5:2, to Zechariah 9:9, to Hosea 11:1, to Isaiah 7:9? We can go on and how will you respond to what Jesus has done for you? For some of you, this is a reminder. You know all this. You gave yourself to Jesus a long time ago, and maybe you've wandered off, maybe you've kind of slipped away, and this is a reminder to say, I need to get back on track. I need to follow him like I promised him that I would. For some of you, this is a reminder that simply leads to joy. Right? Because when I understand what Jesus has done for me, that leads to joy. I no longer have to live in the past. I can look ahead to the future, full of joy, full of hope, full of peace. And for some of you this morning, this is a call to you to give yourself to him. Listen, for Jesus, this is the worst deal ever. Jesus gave up everything, and in return, he got me. That's a bad deal for him. It's a great deal for me. And listen, maybe you're thinking, well, Jesus maybe gave up everything for some of these people here, but he didn't do it for me because I'm pretty messed up. You know what? He did it for you. Jesus is more than excited to make that bad deal with you. And if you're willing to give him yourself, he will give you his whole self. So if you give him your brokenness, if you hand over your guilt, your shame, your regret, if you turn all of that over to him, in exchange, he will give you his perfection, his righteousness, his holiness, his life. So that when God looks at you, he will not see the person who destroyed his creation. He will see Jesus. And he will love you and accept you and welcome you and adopt you as your own. And you have a new life to live for him if you'll simply give your life to him. And listen, to do that, you don't have to do anything special. Right? There's no ceremony you have to go through. There's no ritual. There's no secret words you have to say. It's simply you right here, right now, right where you are, in your mind, acknowledging, God, I'm yours. I've lived for me up to now, but now I give myself to you. I was wrong, and I'm returning to you. And if you'll do that, you're beginning a journey that will take you to places you could never imagine. Jesus loves you more than anyone ever could, more than anyone ever has. He did all of this for you. What will you do with him? Let's pray.